Good evening and welcome to another brand new segment of The Lost and Forgotten on TV1. Tonight our topic would focus on the Burmese who settled here in Sri Lanka, and joining us in the studios as usual is Dr. Zameer Careem from the University of Colombo. Good evening to you, Zameer, and welcome to the show.
Very good evening, Hassaan.
Zameer, as always, let us start talking about the Burmese community by going back to their arrivals. When did they start arriving in the country?
Okay, so the history of the Burmese in Sri Lanka can be traced back to remote antiquity. So since time immemorial, our country has maintained strong ties with Burma. So as both our countries are Theravada Buddhist nations, since many centuries, we have maintained strong religious, cultural, diplomatic and economic ties. And we have had many Burmese monks, pilgrims, laymen, as well as officials who had come to Ceylon, Burmese emissaries had settled in our country, and we have had many Burmese students who came to Ceylon during the colonial period. Likewise, we have many Burmese families who lived in Ceylon during the colonial period as well. Many settled in different parts of Ireland. We even had a Miss Sri Lanka who is of Burmese descent. And also the Burmese ambassador's wife, there was a Burmese ambassador whose wife was in fact killed. She had a mysterious death in Colombo. This was in 1967.
Tell us a little bit about that incident.
Okay, so this incident took place on the 15th of October 1967. It was a Sunday morning, and the Burmese ambassador to Ceylon at the time was Saw Boonwot. So Saw Boonwot hailed from an aristocratic royal family of Burma, and he was married to this lady called Shirley Boonwot. Right, so she was this very vivacious, magnetic, lovely petite woman who was living in our country. She was the Burmese ambassador's wife, and she was killed mysteriously on Sunday morning at 8:30. The bricklayers, this incident took place at the Burmese ambassador's residence. So the Burmese ambassador's residence is now the Capri Club, which is on Turret Road. So the house is sandwiched between Turret Road, is now Anagarika Dharmapala Mawata, and Green Path. So in this property, it was originally called Carlton Lodge. Back then it was called Carlton Lodge because it was originally owned by Korea Carlton, and later it was occupied by the Burmese ambassador. So Burmese ambassador Saw Boonwot. It made headlines in 1967. Sunday morning, October 15th, 1967, this lady was mysteriously killed in her residence. She was found dead. And the bricklayers, as well as those who were living in the neighborhood, they heard gunshots in the morning. They heard gunshots, and this lady was found dead. This was at 8:30, 9 that period, and she was cremated at 1. So no one really knew what happened to this lady. The whole house is shrouded in mystery. It's surrounded with miasma of scandal even to this day, because no one really knows who assassinated her, what really happened, who killed her, and it's a very mysterious incident which took place. And I'll tell you the story. What happened was, this lady, because the Burmese ambassador was married to this young vivacious, young, pretty lady. Okay, so she was called Shirley Boonwot. She was a socialite. She was very popular, like in Sri Lanka. So in 1964, that is when she met a Sri Lankan man named Rex De Silva. Rex De Silva was the leader of a band called Rhythm Dukes. So there was a club called Blue Leopard, which was at Tabrabane Hotel, which is now Grand Oriental Hotel. So he used to perform in various clubs. So this Rex De Silva was a dashing young Sri Lankan man, and he sported a beard. And this lady is said to have had a clandestine affair with the Sri Lankan man called Rex De Silva. She was already married. She was the wife of the Burmese ambassador. She had 2 children, but still it's a rumor that we don't really know what happened. So we have to see it from all perspectives. Yeah. Exactly. So we don't really know what happened back then, but she's rumored to have had a clandestine affair with Rex De Silva. So this is starting from 1964 October onwards. And then they maintained strong ties with each other. She used to go to this club. She was a very popular person in Ceylon at the time. Everyone knew who Shirley Boonwot was. And she was very good with the people, not just with the VIPs, but even with ordinary people. She was very good, even with her maids and domestic helps and all those. And then what happened was, on October 15, 1967, morning, she was mysteriously killed. No one knew what happened, how was she killed. Then people, the bricklayers, according to their reports, she tried to come to the entrance, and she was half dragged and half carried into the house. She was carried into the house. Then they had received a call from the Burmese ambassador's residence to Maurice Raymond's, the undertaker. So he was given a call, and he had been told that you should prepare a coffin by 12:30. A coffin had to be prepared. So usually the undertaker would visit the place to take the measurements. But the ambassador had apparently mentioned that this is a height, she's 5 feet 3 inches tall, and prepare a casket, and this has to be delivered to the house by 12:30. Okay? And then no post-mortem was carried out. a doctor was asked to come in, Dr. Mendes. So he inspected the body. When Dr. Mendes had gone to the house, this Shirley Boonwort, this beautiful lady, was found dead at the bottom of the stairway, right? So she was found dead. And then there was no autopsy performed. That's the interesting part. No autopsy was performed, but he had in fact declared that she had died of cerebral hemorrhage as a result of hypertension. Okay, so no autopsy was performed. None of those things were done. And then the people, the bricklayers and the next door maid, different versions of the stories are available if you read various, because the Daily News, Times, all those newspapers published this. It made headlines, not just in Ceylon, but across the globe. So what happened was the doctor had mentioned that she had died of cerebral hemorrhage. Then the undertaker was prevented from, measuring her body. And then those bricklayers had informed the Ceylonese police that there is something mysterious that has happened in this house. We heard gunshots in the morning. The lady was found, she was literally dragged into the house, and we heard the gunshots. Now we have been told that the lady is killed. So people surged in from all quarters of Colombo. So throngs of people were at the entrance of this house. They couldn't get inside. And they wanted to know what happened to this woman, because she was very popular. She was a socialite in our country. And then what they did do is that their body was cremated at 1 p.m. at Kanatta, not buried. So the ambassador, there were only 2 Burmese monks who were brought to the scene. There were certain rituals performed. But the Ceylonese police officers, the CID, wanted to investigate the matter. When they wanted to investigate, the Burmese ambassador to Ceylon at the time, Saw Boonwort, invoked diplomatic immunity. So this is a classic example of the egregious disuse of diplomatic immunity. Because of diplomatic immunity, not a single police officer was allowed to step into the Burmese ambassador's residence. So no investigation was carried out in our country. Then the Prime Minister, Dudley Sena Naik, had informed the CID officials, immigration officers, as well as the customs to prevent any Burmese official, any member of the embassy from escaping the nation. Right? So there was one report that he was apparently arrested, and then there was no questioning done because he had invoked diplomatic immunity, so he was not prosecuted. And then they wanted to question the Malaysian High Commissioner's son, because he was also involved in this whole thing, because there were 3 men involved in this. And when the Malaysian High Commissioner was approached, he too got diplomatic immunity, and his son, Enchi Bahadoon, was prevented from being interviewed. So this incident is still enshrouded in mystery. No one really knows who killed this lady. She was reduced to ashes, and after a few weeks, the Burmese officials came from Burma, and Saw Boonwort, who had invoked this diplomatic immunity, left our country. No one knows whether was he prosecuted in Burma, because the Burmese officials informed the Ceylonese government that the necessary steps would be taken in Burma. So we don't know whether was he arrested, was he jailed, was he imprisoned. There is no information. According to one of the news reports that I read, he was later made ambassador of Burma to France, and he went to various other places.
Will you be able to outline the reasons as to why the Burmese came to Ceylon? What attracted them towards this country?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, it's because of the religious and cultural ties, because both our countries are Buddhist nations. So since 4th century BC, we have maintained strong ties with Burma. Burma is now called Myanmar. So it was previously called the Union of Burma until 1989. So since 1989, it's called Myanmar. Okay, so since the time of Vijayabahu, Parakana Bahu the Great, during periods of various kings, we have had many Burmese pilgrims, Burmese monks and novices who came to our country, because we had many temples. We still have some of the world's renowned Buddhist temples are in Sri Lanka. So when you talk about Mahavihara, Roen, all those various temples we have in our country, so these places were centers of worship, centers of pilgrimage and teaching. So because of these reasons, we had many Burmese monks who came to our country and novices. They were ordained into monkhood here in Sri Lanka. Likewise, when we wanted to send our monks, the Burmese in fact had monasteries and temples built for the Sri Lankan monks who were sent to Burma to be ordained into monkhood. So we both practiced Theravada Buddhism. So according to the Upasampata ordination rituals were carried out in Burma, and this was when our country was threatened by foreign forces, and when we had issues of organizing these rituals in our country, that is when we sent our monks, our priests, our novices, they went to Burma and they were ordained into monkhood during different periods. So our ties were strengthened during different periods of various kings. So during the time of Vijayabahu I, this was in the 11th century, so that was when there were many Buddhist monks who went to Burma. There were many temples built in Burma, especially in the Bagan area of Burma. So Bagan area is a very large archaeological site. It's still in Burma. You'll find there were 10,000 temples built, and now you'll find around 2,700 temples are still around. Okay, so you'll find many temples that were dedicated to Sri Lankan monks, as well as there were monasteries built just for the Sri Lankan priests who came to Burma. So I'm talking about 11th century. This was during the time of Vijayabahu I, and he maintained strong ties. The Tripitaka is actually the scripture, the holy, the sacred canon of Theravada Buddhism, is believed to have been introduced from Sri Lanka to Burma. And this happened during the time of Vijayabahu, and some sources say that it was in fact introduced prior to that, but from Sri Lanka. So the Tripitaka, the holy scriptures, the canon, the Theravada Buddhist canon, was introduced to Burma during Vijayabahu's period. That this was from Sri Lanka. So it has also been recorded in various chronicles, such as the Glass Palace Chronicle, which is one of the most popular chronicles in Burma. So when you talk about the ties, there were many occasions during which the Burmese came to Sri Lanka in order to get hold of the tooth relic, as well as the relic bowl of Ceylon. And during the reign of Parakramabahu as well, there were strong ties established with Burma. There is a temple which was built by a Burmese prince called Rajakumar. This was in 1113. And if you go to this temple is in Bagan, and it has, mural, the frescoes, artworks are all about Mahavamsa stories. So when you go to this temple called Gyomji, okay, Kumbokji, and you can pronounce it differently because it's Burmese. So this large temple, which was erected during, the early years of the 12th century, so it features, when you go and look at the frescoes are all about the stories, the Vamsa Kathavas. So you'll find Devanampiyatisa's frescoes of various kings of our country, Buddhadasa and Sanghamitta's arrival to the nation, Elara's, the bell which was rung by the cow. So there are various Devanampiyatisa accepting Buddhism since the advent of Buddhism up until the period of Vijayabahu I. So all these important events of our history, our heroes, our kings, were hero worshipped in Burma. So they were revered as gods, as great leaders, and there was so much of respect given by the Burmese to the Ceylonese at the time. So as I mentioned, during Vijayabahu's period, the Holy Tripitaka was introduced to Burma, and during Parakramabahu's reign, in fact, Parakramabahu sent his troops to Burma and conquered Burma. This was in 12th century. So like Burma maintained strong ties with Parakramabahu. This was during the time of Onwang Situ, right? So there was a king called Onwang Situ, and during his reign, Parakramabahu maintained strong ties with him. So we had, back then, our country was considered one of the best nations in the world, especially in the Asian, a powerful country in the Asian subcontinent. I'm talking about 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. So we exported various commodities, precious stones, ivory, and all those things. And also when countries required help, it was Ceylon that extended support. So when Among Situ, when that king of Burma required military aid, or when he needed soldiers, when he wanted men to fight valiantly, it was Parakramabahu I of our country, the great Sri Lankan king, sent our troops to Burma. So in return to all the help that was rendered by the Burmese king used to send us white elephants to our nation, right? So this continued for a very long period of time, and then Among Situ's son, called Narotu, became the king of Burma. Okay, so when he became the king of Burma, he wasn't really pleased with the relationship which his father had established with Ceylon. So he wanted to sever the ties which his ancestors had maintained for several centuries with Ceylon. So this was in the 12th century when King Parakramabahu the Great was the king of our nation. So what did he do, this Naratu, the king of Burma? He captured the Ceylonese envoys, traders, merchants were captured by Naratu. He executed the Sri Lankans in Burma because Sri Lanka maintained strong trade ties. So the envoys, the emissaries were captured, they were tormented, their riches were looted, their elephants and coins were looted by this king called Naratu. Okay, so he was a Burmese king, and this was in the 12th century. And then Ceylon had also sent a Sinhalese princes to Cambodia. So Cambodia is a nation in Southeast Asia. So if you want to go to Cambodia, you have to pass through Burma, right? So this king Naratu his troops captured the princess. So she was sent to get married to Jayavarman VI's daughter. That's what most of the historians believe. So if you really want to read a detailed account about it, you can read Dr. Hema Gunatilaka's various books and various papers that have been authored by her. So this king was a tyrant, and he had captured many Sri Lankans, tortured them. So there are different reasons that are given to why was he against the Sri Lankans. What's the reason behind this hostility? So one story is that his advisor, his Rajaguru, was in fact a Sri Lankan. So the Rajaguru of King Naratu of Burma was in fact a Sri Lankan. And that could have been the reason. He had some sort of a dispute with the king of Sri Lanka, probably the Sri Lankan advisor. He was probably chased off from our country. So he thought of, let's seize this opportunity and, sever the ties which Burma maintained with Ceylon.
So the king was ill-informed about Sri Lanka?
Yes, he was ill-informed. And there's another reason. I went through Hema Gunatilaka's paper. It's been mentioned that according to the Glass Palace Chronicle, Naratu's wife was apparently a Sri Lankan lady. There are different versions of the same story. So one version says that she was from Bengal and from other parts of India, while another version says that she was a Sri Lankan lady, and then and King Naratu sired a son with her, and he had apparently strangled her and killed the queen. Okay, so I don't probably because of the relationship that he had with his wife as well. That could be a reason. We can only surmise, but we don't really know what happened in the 12th century. Anyways, he captured several Sri Lankan envoys, emissaries were tortured, they were put to death, and they were subject to gruesome tortures by this king. So then King Parakanabahu I of our country was kept informed that this Naratu is torturing our Sri Lankan envoys. Then Parakanabahu decided, let's wage war. So he built this military naval fleet and built several ships. It took him 5 months to build all these ships. And because he knew that the Burmese would attack with their elephants, so he made sure that he made arrows that were powerful enough to slaughter the elephants, right? So he built those massive ships in order to transport the elephants from Sri Lanka as well. So imagine you had to travel all the way from Sri Lanka to Burma. So Parakanabahu I was a man who maintained strong ties with many nations. We had diplomats and courtiers from across the globe in our country in 12th century. Our courtiers, our ministers spoke different languages besides the native languages of our country. They were also proficient in Greek and Indian languages. I'm talking about 12th century. Sri Lanka was a superpower at the time. So he sent a huge army, and he too traveled. And then this army, it's been described that it was, when you read Chulavamsa, Rajavaliya, Pujavaliya, Nikaya Sangrahaya, and all these chronicles of our country talk about the invasion, and then it was like a floating island. So many ships with all these elephants and troops and soldiers, and he sent even the medicines and even whatever that was required for the soldiers to sustain themselves, because it was a weary journey all the way to Burma. And then King Naratu was kept informed that the Sri Lankan king is now heading towards Burma, towards Bagan, the area of Lower Burma. And then he sent an envoy so that he could settle this dispute. He didn't want his kingdom to be, conquered by a Sri Lankan king, a mighty emperor from Sri Lanka. And they captured Burma, and this was in 12th century, and he entered the kingdom. He managed to slaughter Naratu's troops, and he entered a place called Kusumia, and then he managed to capture Naratu, and Naratu was killed. So there are different versions of the story. So the Sri Lankan chronicles mention that it was the Sri Lankan king who captured.
So was the entire nation of Burma captured at that time?
The Bagan area, it's a large territory. Okay, so the Bagan area, the entire kingdom was captured. And what King Parakanabahu did was he appointed a Sinhalese official to be in charge of this place, and then he returned to the country, and he in fact paraded around Kusumia. King Parakanabahu is believed to have paraded around Kusumia in order to inform because even the countrymen were not pleased with their king. So the Burmese were very pleased that the Sri Lankan king came all the way from, an island, and then he captured Burma and in fact helped them, because he was a tyrant. So no one was in fact happy with this despot king. So Parakanabahu overthrew Naratu, and after some time, it was a special administrative region of Sri Lanka. This was the same time when Parakanabahu helped the Pandyans from the Chola invasions, from the Chola incursions and forays. The Pandyans were also assisted by Parakanabahu I of Sri Lanka. So he helped the Burmese, and Naratu was usurped, he was assassinated, and later Naratu's son, Narapittu and Narapittu, the king of Burma, so his son, his heir to the throne, was appointed as the king of Burma.
In which year did
this is all in 12th century. So Parakanabahu's reign started from 1123, it went on until 1186, that period. This is 12th century. So then Narapittu became the king. Okay, so he was also the grandson of Among Situ, okay, the king who maintained strong ties with Burma. And Naratu's son, though his father was against Sri Lanka, he maintained strong ties with our country. So he built special monasteries and special temples in order to have our kings. There were many monasteries built during this period. As I mentioned, several temples were erected. And the Pali language doesn't have a script. Okay? So the Pali language was taught to the Burmese in Sinhala script. So there are various records of that as well. So Sri Lankans were so powerful, the high ordination ceremonies used to take place in Burma. So when you talk about all these chapters of the Sangha, I'm sure you must have heard of the Amarapura Nikaya, Ramana Nikaya. So the Amarapura and Ramana Nikaya are actually established on the Bhikkhu traditions of Burma. So it is the Burmese who introduced these traditions to our country. So when our country was, invaded during the colonial period, especially during the Portuguese period, what happened was we couldn't organize all these ordination ceremonies in our country. Okay, so because the foreign forces were not allowing those things to take place. So that was the period when the Ceylonese went to Burma and they were ordained into monkhood in Burma. Right, so the Siam Nikaya was introduced from Siam. Siam is present-day Thailand. This was in 1753, that period. And then later, during the reign of Kirtisi Rajasinghe of our country, he had this rule because he was an Indian king. And you know how in India you have this social stratification based on the caste system. So he said only those who are of Govigama caste can be ordained into monkhood. So there was an absurd rule as such being passed. And then those who belonged to other castes were prevented from being ordained into monkhood here in Sri Lanka. So because of that particular reason, all these monks had to go to another country to be ordained, and they had to go to Burma and they were ordained into monkhood. So Amarapura Nikaya was introduced in 1800, and then in 1860s, that period, the Ramana Nikaya was introduced to our country due to various reasons. And all these Vinaya disputes in Ceylon were also solved by these Burmese monks who came to our country. There are Burmese temples even now in Colombo, in various other places.
Yes,
you have
so
Burmese.
very briefly, if I may interrupt you, what did Sri Lanka have to offer to the Burmese monks who came to the country?
Because we had those hermitages, the monasteries, and because our country's Mahavihar was very popular at the time. So Buddhist teachings, this country was a center of Buddhist learning and pilgrimages, and we had the tooth relic in our nation. So it was a site of pilgrimage. So we had pilgrims from various parts of Burma who came to our country. In fact, in 1899, you have the golden casket in Dalada Maligava. So the golden casket was brought from Burma in 1899. Okay, so in 1899, certain members of the royal family, the King Thibaw, the last king of Burma's daughters, along with various courtiers, officials, pilgrims, monks, laymen, novices, craftsmen, jewelers, they came to Ceylon 1899 January. The ship that brought them was called SS Derbyshire. So they came to Ceylon and they offered a golden casket full made of gold encrusted with jewels. So jeweled golden casket and a silver canopy. Right, a silver canopy that too was jeweled, and these two were brought by the Burmese to Ceylon. 1,200 Burmese came to Ceylon in 1899. 1,200 came to Ceylon, and when they landed at the port, the whole price, the whole canopy as well as the golden casket was valued at 100,000 rupees. 100,000 rupees in 1899 was a huge amount, because even in 1968, $1 was 4.7 rupees. $1, right, $1 US was equivalent to 4.7 Sri Lanka Ceylonese rupees in 1968. So 1899, we were a far more prosperous nation at the time. We were a British colony. So during this period, 100,000 rupees, and then the Ceylonese government imposed tax, the British government at the time. So it was 5,500 rupees had to be paid. So there was a Sri Lankan who paid half the price, that is 2,750, and the remaining amount was paid by the Burmese. And this golden casket was taken to the Burmese temple, which is in Maradana. In Maradana, you have two temples. One, you have the Vinaya temple, which was named in honor of a Burmese priest. And then you have the Burmese temple, which is in Dematagoda, in Reservoir Road. So Reservoir Road area, that area, you still have a lot of Burmese living. It's a Burmese temple. So it was first brought to Colombo, because from Colombo port straight to the temple, and from there it had to be transported by train to Kandy, because this was to be offered to the Dalada Maligava. They originally had a casket which had been presented earlier by Sri Vikrama Rajasinghe, and then this new golden casket. The reason why they brought it is because it was a belief by the Burmese that if you offer something to the tooth relic, to the temple here in Sri Lanka, that it would avert the doom, the threat which had affected their country. So that was a period when Burma was conquered by the British. So Thibaw, the last king of Burma, was exiled to a place called far-flung colony called Ratnagiri. And do you know that in 1886, right, there was a gift presented to Queen Victoria. 1885, Burma was captured after the Third Anglo-Burmese War. In 1886 January, her birthday is on May 24th, Queen Victoria's. But there was a birthday gift presented to Queen Victoria. This was in 1886 January. And guess what's the birthday gift? It was Burma. Burma was an entire country with all its people was offered as a birthday gift in 1886 to Queen Victoria. While the king and the royal family were asked to leave, like they had no time to pack their stuff, they were asked to leave to a place in Ratnagiri, which is in Maharashtra.
Did she accept the gift, by the way?
She accepted the gift because that's the reason why Burma remained a colony until 1948. It was a British colony. In fact, Lord Mountbatten, the Viceroy of India, the British Viceroy of India, his title is Lord Mountbatten, Earl of Burma. It's like as if the British owned the place. So they got the entire country and it was presented to Queen Victoria as a gift. So this was in 1886 January. Anyways, getting back to the story. So it was this last king of Burma's daughters who came to Ceylon. So if you want to know more about this golden casket that was brought by these princes as well as her people, you can read the 20th century impressions of Ceylon by Arnold Wright, a book called The Golden Casket from Burma, which is written by T.J. Harrison in 1899. Likewise, Brooke Elliott's book, The Real Ceylon. All these books talk about this golden casket which was brought to our country. And in Roen during 1930s, 1940s, they were planning on refurbishing the temple. So they wanted the Chudamanikya. Chudamanikya is like a precious stone which is kept at the pinnacle of the temple. So they wanted a Chudamanikya. So they couldn't find a Chudamanikya in our country. Then the high priest of the Burmese temple in Colombo went to Burma and he brought a Chudamanikya from Burma, because Burma is renowned for its sapphires and Burmese rubies and various other precious stones. So they brought this Chudamanikya to the country and then they realized that the Chudamanikya was too large. The Chudamanikya which was brought to be placed at the pinnacle of Roen was large. So he had to take it back to Burma because we didn't have the cutters to cut the stone. So when it was taken back to Burma, they realized that there is a small defect. So when there is a defect, they would not offer it to the temple. That's the rule. So then they found another crystal and it was brought to Sri Lanka in the 1940s and it was installed at the pinnacle of the Roen. So the Burmese and the Ceylonese have maintained strong ties since the Vijayabahu's period, who maintained strong ties with Anuradha, who was the king of Burma. So since the time immemorial, up until now, we have since maintained strong ties with the Burmese. So, yeah.
Let's shift our attention to the Burmese community. How did they form themselves as a community and get about their business in the country? Tell us a little bit about them very quickly.
Besides the whole Burmese monks and novices who came to our country, there were many Burmese who came to Ceylon during the colonial period to pursue their higher studies. Unlike now, Ceylon was a very famous nation. It was a place where people used to send their children to receive English education. So there were many Burmese. There was a Burmese man. These Burmese who came to Sri Lanka, they studied at some of the illustrious institutions of our nation. So, for example, when you talk about Che Hatun, he became a justice in Burma. He studied at Ananda College in Colombo. So this was during the early years of the 20th century, 1920s, 30s, that period. Many Burmese students were sent by the Burmese families to Ceylon and they came to our country. Che Hatun, who became a justice in Burma, his son Yen Hatun, who also became an entrepreneur and lawyer, and he was also running the scouting movement over there. The G family, I don't know whether you have heard of the G family, the Mong G, he was a Burmese who came to our country and he later got married to a Chinese in Ceylon. They all lived in Mardana, Reservoir Road, Dembaragoda area, because there were lots of Chinese. There's still Chinese families there because they were often mistaken for Chinese as well, because their surnames also sounding Chinese and they look very Chinese in terms of how they look and stuff, physiognomy. So when we talk about the Burmese, there were many Burmese family, and one of the descendants of this Mong G, Nadia G, became Miss Sri Lanka for Miss World in 2018. So we had a Miss Sri Lanka who hailed from a Burmese family. So she was of Burmese and Chinese ancestry. So there were many Burmese who established Chinese restaurants in our country. All these, I don't want to mention the names of famous restaurants in our nation, but most of those famous Chinese restaurants were in fact established by the Burmese. So the G family, in fact, this Mong G, the first progenitor of the G clan in Ceylon, he played rugby for Trinity College, he won the Trinity colours and various other institutions, St. Joseph's College, Colombo, Royal, St. Thomas's, all these schools had many Burmese who came to Ceylon to pursue their higher studies, because our country was very popular at the time. From, we had Anagarika Dharmapala, Alcott and Murray Muses Higgins, various Buddhist theosophists were living in Ceylon at the time, starting from 1860s up until the 1940s, that period. So because our country was very popular at the time for education, so from Maharajas of India to Burmese aristocrats and royals and descendants of various families, squires and all those, they sent their children to pursue their studies in Ceylon. So some of them eventually married Sri Lankans and they settled in our country.
How many Burmese are living in Sri
Now
Lanka
we don't have
present?
a specific record on how many Burmese. Even the G family, many of them have in fact migrated to Australia, right? Likewise, even there were Anglo-Burmese who came to our country. Anglo-Burmese are those who are Eurasians of mixed Burmese and European descent from Burma. They came to Ceylon and some of them got married to the Sri Lankan burghers. So even the Sri Lankan burgher families, some of them have Burmese ancestry. So we had a Claude de Cresta, who served as a judge in Burma. Likewise, there were a few Parsis like Nasser Wanji, the Madan Studios, who ran Madan Studios. Some of the Parsis also established their businesses, their enterprises in Rangoon. Rangoon is now Yangon in Burma. And recently we had the Rohingya refugees from Burma. So they were given asylum, temporary asylum in Sri Lanka. So there were 3 waves of Rohingya refugees who came to Ceylon. They were also from Burma. So Burma is now called Myanmar. So since time immemorial till date, we have always had Burmese families. There are a few Burmese who are still living in the country, just a handful of them, not many, and many have migrated to foreign lands, and many have in fact migrated and they have now settled in countries like Australia and England and various other places. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Zameer, for that wonderful insight into the Burmese community of Sri Lanka. We spoke about several interesting stories that none of us have actually heard of. Thank you very much once again. On that note, we wrap this segment of The Lost and Forgotten on TV1. Thank you very much for stopping by. We'll be back next week, same time, same place, with another interesting episode. Take care and God bless.